Info. My name is Tunji Andrews, and we're going straight into it now. I have with me in the studio the just the how do they describe that thing in Nigeria? The immediate past president of the AFC, the Africa Finance Corporation, in the studio with us. It's an honor, by the way. If you notice at the beginning of this show, I played the song. There's a line in that song which I actually quoted it when I was saying congratulations on your when you finished your tenure. I'm not sure you. I'm going to explain it. So it's "Àwọn babaláyé tó lówó lọ́wọ́ mo mọ̀." I hope I got that Yoruba right. But City of Lagos, yes, it's always great to have people close like this to you. Welcome to the show, sir. Let's start with that. We're going to be talking about infrastructure and in Nigeria. Let's start with the deficit. Is there a figure attached to the deficit in terms of what we need to be? Okay, so let's leave out countries like Singapore, China, Japan. Let's talk more Russia kind of infrastructure. you know, so it's not exactly world class, but it works. You know, how far are we from there? Is there a figure that we can point to?
Well, firstly, let's say good morning, and
Good morning.
It's a pleasure to be on the show. The question of how big an infrastructure deficit we have, I think, is something that many institutions study and try and estimate. There's not really a firm number because it depends on different things. For example, what do you classify as infrastructure? Would you include schools as infrastructure or not?
Hospitals,
that kind of thing. You've obviously got roads and power and bridges and ports, and those are clearly infrastructure. But the more social infrastructure can be, equally as important, but is harder to define, and people have different definitions. Having said that, I mean, I tend to look at the World Bank, and they study these things, and the latest report that they produced shows that they estimate Nigeria needs between now and 2040, and I'm not sure why they chose 2040. It's kind of a random year, but
Yeah.
that's what they did. They estimate that Nigeria needs about $880 billion worth of investment.
Yeah.
And they estimate that Nigeria will have about $660 billion. So if you do the maths, that comes to something like $12 to $13 billion a year in terms of infrastructure spending deficit. And if you translate that into Naira, that comes to something like 4.5 to 5 trillion Naira per annum.
So we should just forget our budget and just spend on infrastructure. And that doesn't mean that we're going to see the immediate benefits. It's going to still take a number of years for it to, translate into Naira and Kobo on the streets, and or at least tangible infrastructure. We've been trying to build the Lagos Ibadan. It exists, but we've been trying to rebuild it for a number of years. The Ajaokuta steel plant has a real network trying to get to it. It's not gotten there forever. The Lagos, is it Lagos Kano, or there's a real line that's supposed to go from Lagos to Kano, branching off many places, still has not happened. Is there? Okay, so we were talking about this before we came in on to the studio, and I was saying that with so many problems, you do talk about, and this is one of the things you hear entrepreneurs say: when there are problems, you should be excited as an entrepreneur. Looking at Nigeria's problems, will any investor be excited to look at the fact that, oh my God, they have so many problems? Maybe I can make a lot of money coming in here.
Well, I think that's the starting point, maybe, for an investor looking at things. So, are there gaps in the market? Are there problems? So, if you take, for example, something that's very topical, the congestion around Apapa,
Yeah.
you know, many entrepreneurs should or would be looking at that and thinking, okay, where can I see
Plug in, yeah.
opportunities? Perhaps I can sort of do a car park for trucks to get them off the streets and charge them things.
Idea.
Perhaps I can, go and outsource services in terms of processing things through the port to make the throughput faster. Perhaps, I can look for contracts to, repair the roads and make it ingress and
Ching, 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 ching,
egress,
ching, ching, ching. Ideas everywhere.
Easier. So that's the first stage. Then you would sort of look and say, okay, is there really an opportunity? So is the market as big as it seems, etc. And then how can I access that opportunity? So, who is going to give me the contract? Do they have the money to pay? I'm talking about maybe the roads.
Yeah.
If I want to do the car park thing, is there land? What permits do I need to do? Can I get that easily?
And then that brings even more troubles to you.
Then you look at the financing aspects. So if I do this, how much money can I make from doing it? How much is the financing going to cost me? What's the ultimate return? And then, if you're a foreign investor, you then also look at things like, okay, I brought my money in. Can I take it
my
out?
money out when I want to.
What rate am I going to get it? Am I going to be able to take it out at, etc.? So, when I was at the AFC, for example, we used to talk about a concept of a funnel. So you have maybe 100 projects come into your organization, and bear in mind that these are projects which somebody has already spent some time putting together, right?
Yeah.
Because AFC was just is a financier principally, although they do work on developing projects as well. So say 100 projects come into that funnel. At the end of the day, maybe 4 or 5 of those will get funding. So you start with the big ideas, and then you start to funnel it to see what is practicable. And, that really cuts off a lot. If we're talking about infrastructure in Nigeria, there's also a first funnel, which is, are these projects even bankable by the private sector? So, for example, a rural road somewhere in randomly saying Benue State that can connect people growing tomatoes to the nearest, person who's
how do
going
you
to
charge? How do you build the road? How do you make your money back? How do you?
Well, yeah, that is not a private sector project. That needs to be done
by the government.
Because there's really no return or no cash return that you're going to get on that road. Although the developmental returns can be actually huge and probably even bigger than maybe decongesting Apapa,
Yeah, I agree with that. And the question then comes back to the fact that we still have a lot more of those kind of projects that you just spoken about, in terms of, while there are a lot of roads that we need to fix, but we generally have more of a deficit in areas like healthcare, schools. We were talking about this before we started the show, on terms of the kind of people we're breathing for to take over from us in maybe 30, 40 years. The level of education we're giving to them right now. Because if you give them substandard education, you should expect a substandard workforce in the future. So how then do we fix it? Because obviously the government doesn't have the money. Where we have a 7 trillion naira budget, which is heavily weighing towards recurrent expenditure. And even that 7 trillion naira, let's say it was all capital expenditure, we still don't have the entire 7 trillion naira, 8 trillion naira. We're still borrowing quite a large chunk of it. Where does Nigeria get this kind of money from?
So that raises a whole bunch of issues, and I think it's easier to just try and unpick these things one at a time. So the first thing is the infrastructure that we have today. Are we using that as efficiently as possible? And at least according to the Brookings Institution, the answer is no. And, they estimate that there's a 40% gap between the efficiency of use of infrastructure in Nigeria compared with the average in sub-Saharan Africa. So we're not talking about developed countries, which is which is bad.
City of Lagos, what that means is that you're like, in terms of the Premiership, you're in the Championship, and you're not even in the top at the top of the Championship. You're at the middle of the Championship. That's where we are.
But the positive side of that is that it means that there's a lot more that we can do with what we have on the ground, assuming that it's operated more efficiently. This same study shows that just by improving regulation to the average standard of Africa, that we can reduce that deficit by 8%.
True.
So that's just on better regulation without even doing anything.
Without even
with
putting any new funds on the ground, just better managing the...
So then if you sort of try and squeeze a bit more performance out of the assets, you can close that gap. I think the second point to realize is that there is, or at least there ought to be, a virtuous circle generated as you improve infrastructure. So as you improve infrastructure, the whole point of having infrastructure is that it makes your companies more competitive. So as you improve infrastructure, your companies ought to become more competitive, ought to earn bigger profits, ought to be able to pay more taxes, and therefore ought to be able to help fund more infrastructure. I use the word ought a lot in that in that chain because you also need to make sure that those things really happen. So what are you really are you spending your infrastructure investments improving the right things? I'll give an example. So there's a lot of emphasis right now on rail transportation, and I think rightly so. But the emphasis, at least what one sees in the media, is around passenger transportation.
As against good.
No, exactly.
Cargo.
Now, passenger transportation is sexy. You can show photos of people sitting in carriages being transported up and down. But really, if you want to look at what has the maximum benefit for your economy, it's can you move goods and services across your country cheaply and effectively. If I can produce a bar of soap in Kano for X, but it costs me twice as much as the cost of production to ship it down to Lagos, then that becomes much more unaffordable for people in Lagos. So if you can halve the cost or make the cost a quarter, then you can improve
help the economy. Because even the people will have more sales because it will then fit into people's income brackets, and then they'll be able to afford it more. And then, of course, it creates more development for the regions that are producing because they will have more markets, especially in agricultural produce, where we have a lot of agricultural produce getting spoiled before it reaches the market. It just makes a whole lot of sense. But like you said, passenger rail is sexy. It's that one that you can take pictures of. It's not really nice to take. When you take pictures of cargo trains, it just doesn't look really, efficient, and beautiful for the pages. But there is a national integrated infrastructure master plan, which of course is supposed to run from 2014 to 2043. We're in 2018, and it also seems like it's dead on arrival because I don't see any clear direction for it, especially in tandem with what we are doing right now. So it's like we say one thing, we want to do one thing, and then we're doing a whole bunch of other things. A lot of things that have no direct correlation with what we said we wanted to do. So if you look at the ERGP, in terms of that's a vague document in itself, but it itself doesn't naturally tie into the National Integrated Infrastructure Master Plan. Then our budget, of course. Then you want to tie 3 documents together, which of course are directional documents. Where exactly do we sit down and actually agree with ourselves that, okay, we don't even know where we're going to? Because it just looks like we're doing so many things without moving. So it's like somebody created this document now, and it sounds like a beautiful document: National Integrated Infrastructure Master Plan. And then it has at the end of it 2014 to 2043. So it sounds very aspirational. Then there's the Economic Growth and Recovery document, also a very beautiful name. But in tangents, in tangibility, how does that feel in terms of going into Naira and Kobo on the streets? You were at the top of the AFC. When you, I'm sure they would have come to you with some of these plans before in the past, or at least some subsections of these plans. How did the plans itself excite you?
So as you happen to mention it, I happen to be actually the vice chairman of the private sector sort of input into that infrastructure master plan. And I think it was a very good exercise because it was really quite consultative. I mean, obviously with these things, there's a certain amount of politics that gets into these plans. But overall, I think, and that's unavoidable anywhere you go in the world. But overall, I think, it's a good plan. Maybe sort of try to incorporate too much. But I would say the following, and bear in mind, I'm not a government official, so I can't really talk about this. But I would say that, that master plan is a long-term plan.
Yeah.
And, the budget and the ERGP and all those things are short-term plans which are supposed to feed into that long-term plan. And I would say that a lot of the infrastructure projects that we're seeing, for example, those railway projects that that one always hears about, actually are in the plan.
Yeah.
So I think that, and that plan is quite comprehensive. So I think most of the projects that you are hearing about, even the coastal roads and all those things, are in that plan. The question mark is really about implementation, about sequencing. So in theory, you should be sequencing those things that you can do quickest and that will have the maximum impact.
Yeah.
Perhaps what is being done are those plans, are those particular projects, perhaps not. I'm not involved in that level of planning, so I can't comment about that. But, I don't think that there's necessarily a disconnect between the long-term plan and the shorter-term plans.
I saw a lot of sidestepping in that answer. But yeah, I do feel that. But what do you think? Do you think this is enough for us to go into the future, or are there other things we should start to do now, as in desperately do now? Because I mean, we see the gridlock in Apapa, and the gridlock in Apapa just tells me that oh ye living in Lekki, prepare for the worst. Because I think if that seaport sets up, the refinery in Apapa's Lekki sets up, one, it might slightly decongest Apapa, but it will bring heavy traffic to Lekki, and Lekki has only one major access road.
So I mean, here's the thing. I think that if I were in government, what I would be looking to do is, firstly, everything that can be done by the private sector should be outsourced to the private sector, simply because, as we said earlier, the resources I have in government are not going to cover everything.
Yeah.
And therefore, I should be directing my resources at things that cannot be done by the private sector or cannot be done quickly by the private sector. So I think that's the first point. So if you were to take, say, the Lekki axis, which is rapidly becoming a new area of industrialization, actually, in a way, that is how things should be done. Because Dangote is building a refinery project there.
Yeah.
There's also a port, a deep sea port that is coming up, and hopefully that is going to start going under construction now. These are all being developed, built, financed by the private sector. What the government needs to do is kind of exactly what you were hinting at, which is build the road infrastructure to connect that port properly to the national highway system. And frankly, there's a road plan around that to connect that area, and hopefully that will be done.
I'm even thinking if possibly we can create a rail system directly from there, so they don't have to have anything to do with the roads.
So that that is a good idea, but that is a longer term thing. You need to get the port ready,
functional
first. You need to make sure that the day the port opens, that there's not a massive go slow because there are no roads to connect it to the Shagamu to Ore Expressway, for example, and to other places. You certainly don't want the traffic from that port, and I use the term port, but I mean also the free trade zone, the refinery
region,
to be going through Lagos.
Or the toll gate. I can just imagine that.
Hopefully things coming out of the refinery, particularly the liquid products, actually ultimately wouldn't be trucked and, would be pumped through pipes to storage facilities, away from there, that then the trucks can come and take up. But I think that, that is actually a good example of bringing the private sector
into the discussion
to developing your infrastructure. But these things, you cannot do them in isolation. You can't just divorce everything to the private sector. The government also needs to take a role to fill in the places that the private sector either can't or won't do quickly.
Want to thank you very much for being with us on the show. I just saw Wale, by the way. Wait, I don't know which one is your mic. Good morning.
Can you hear me?
No, I can't hear you.
Okay.
Okay, I can hear you now.
All right.
Good morning, Wale.
Good morning, Tunji.
You have jobs with us on the show.
Definitely, and I brought in.
Do you have jobs like Mr. Andrews? Okay, so which jobs do you have for us on the show?
I brought in a general manager for one of the largest projects in Lekki, for one of the construction projects. She's going to be telling us how to get jobs in real estate, and she doesn't know this. I'm actually planning to squeeze jobs out of her.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
So you're planning to ambush her with your request for jobs.
I'm telling you.
All right, City of Lagos, you have heard him. He will be ambushing somebody on radio this morning. You can hold him after the show. I had nothing to do with it, by the way. All right, we want to thank Mr. Andrew Ali for being with us on the show. Great honor for having you on the show, and thank you for shedding some lights into the infrastructure discourse. I will try to call you again to... I'm still following this National Integrated Infrastructure Master Plan. It looks beautiful. That's a lot of things we do. Vision 2020 also looked beautiful. Vision 2010 looked beautiful. The transformation agenda looked beautiful. But in terms of bringing it on ground, it's always that thing that you keep scratching your head. Why is it so difficult to make into actionable plans? And I think as we go forward, I will be following it keenly. And of course, you are definitely someone who can always consult.
Well, thank you very much. I think you've hit the nail on the head. Execution is one of the issues that we face, and execution starts from sort of making sure you bring everyone along, starts from because these things outlast any one government. And so you need to make sure that there's a lot of consensus around that. So execution, and then you get into the nitty-gritty of executing the plan. But it's been a pleasure being on the show. Thank you for not ambushing me.
We really appreciate it. You've been listening to Mr. Andrew Ali. He has a new complimentary card, which is plain all sides, just has his name. Just the immediate past president of the Africa Finance Corporation, been talking to us about the infrastructure deficit in Nigeria. You can follow him on Twitter. He doesn't allow people retweet his tweets, and his Twitter handle is Yes, yes. But you can just search for Andrew Ali. I think
It's
it's
AF Ali.
AF Ali. Okay, AF Ali. I was going to look for it. Yeah. Okay, yes, AF Ali. LLI, by the way. It's not ALI. All right. Thank you very much for being with us on the show. City of Lagos, you want to look at your timepiece right now. It is 2 minutes after the hour of 10. Still a very young morning on Friday to go out and be profitable.
So business and economy news can be confusing. Markets going up,